So what I'm going to be talking about today is the question of whether to self-publish or to find a publisher, and really from the standpoint of how you should look at yourself as a developer, as a studio. One thing that I think is key is there's really no one answer fits all. I've certainly seen a lot of people say that there is. I've been at conferences where back-to-back you'll have a speaker saying, no matter what, you should always self-publish. And then they book the guy after who says, you should always find a publisher no matter what. And I would say that it's never as simple as that. For an individual studio, one might make sense, but I think it's a lot more complex. And I think the really important thing to look at is who you are as a developer, what your skill set is, what you're lacking, what you're looking for in a publisher, and that's kind of what I'll be talking about. Briefly, who am I to be talking about this? So I've been in mobile gaming since 2004 when I joined Jamdat. They were later acquired by EA. I did about 9 years in kind of external development with them. I spent a couple years at Congregate helping them build up their mobile publishing business. And now for the last year and a half, I've been consulting, working directly with a handful of free-to-play developers. So I've kind of been on both sides of the equation for quite a while. Is kind of the quick overview of what I'll be going into and kind of looking at how to evaluate yourself as a developer. A big part is what are your goals for the game and really being realistic there. What would you be looking for in a publisher, or why are the reasons that you're not looking for a publisher? What you don't know, what you can't do. Sometimes, obviously, as people have said, it's hard to know what you don't know, but really taking a step back and looking at all the parts that are involved in publishing a successful game, whether that's yourself or elsewhere. Your willingness to compromise, financial runway, and so forth. So obviously a big thing is really knowing what your goals are. And I think one key goal ideally is going to be finance, right? You want to actually make some money with your game. And if you are talking to publishers, I think it's really important to be aligned on what this looks like. If you're in a scenario where if you launch, say, a top 150 grossing game, and that's a great business for your studio, you can pay your team, you can put money in the coffers for the next project, but you sign with the publisher and their expectation is to be top 50 or top 75. Let's say now you've launched and you're top 125, right? You're exceeding your goals as a studio, you're really happy. But for the publisher, you're underperforming, and you might actually now slot lower than one of their other games that you were supposed to be outperforming. And so you as a developer are quite happy, but your publisher's not, and you might not be getting kind of what you're looking for out of that partnership, and it can be a big issue. So really being well aligned is really critical, and being realistic in your goals. And certainly there's a lot of other goals other than financial, whether that's getting visibility, creating a new brand, downloads, maybe you're looking to get acquired at some point. If you are talking to publishers, any of those other goals probably don't matter that much to them. So the kind of things you might look for from a publisher or from yourself, right? I think a lot of it gets overlooked and people really just think about installs, but there's a lot more that goes into that, which I'll talk to. So one of the key things when you look at building out a game and what you have is obviously money and funding. Do you have a financial runway in place to build that game? And I think it's critical that you don't just have the 8 to 12 months of funding to build your game, but if you go into soft launch and you find out that you actually do need to do a lot more to your title, that you still have the money to do it. Certainly publishers are a way to do that, but there are publishers that will never be involved in funding. They won't do much funding. Often if you want to go an investment route, you have more control over it. So it's important to kind of make sure you have the runway up front, and there's various ways to go about getting that. Installs is obviously a critical part. If you've made a game, you've worked on it for a while, you want users in there because that's kind of the point. I do think one common mistake is that the only relevant thing when looking at whether or not to publish or self-publish is your ability to get installs in a game. I've worked with a company who several years ago, they worked with a publisher, they launched a game. It was launched into a pretty crowded genre, and they never really cracked the install nut. The LTVs in that game were actually pretty good, but because it was such a crowded marketplace, they couldn't really do a lot of successful paid UA. They didn't really get a lot of featuring out of it, and so they never really got a bunch of installs. But they kept working on the game over time, working on the metrics, and eventually the game was profitable. And so when they started working on their next game, what they felt like they learned from the first game, where they did work with the publisher, was that they weren't really able to crack that nut of installs. They weren't able to do paid UA. So they felt like with their next project, if they could find a way, self-publishing to get installs, that would be a metric of success for them. So with their next project, they took what they learned, and they made a game that was more unique. It was very fun. Their early user experience was great. It was very marketable and approachable. But they didn't really build themselves enough of a financial runway, so when they got into soft launch, they weren't able to really take the months they needed to tweak the game. So they went ahead and pushed this game live, and they got great featuring around the world. They got a whole bunch of installs, which, as I said, was the main thing they were trying to do with game number 2, but because they skipped a lot of these other steps, they ended up having a game that didn't monetize, and it ended up being a significantly worse business than the game they did before. And so they self-published, and they did the thing that's often considered the hardest, which is getting a lot of installs, but then they kind of skipped all those other steps and didn't really realize all the other value they were getting in other places, and they weren't really taking it all into account. And so it's really important to look at all those things, and also to make sure that as you do multiple projects, that you're actually taking the right lessons from what your last game did or didn't do well. Obviously there's a lot that goes into installs. Any one of these topics, user acquisition, marketing, platform relations, can be its own talk. And obviously it's critical, but there's a lot more to it. So free-to-play expertise is obviously a big part of it, as I was kind of just talking about in that last example. Whether you're looking at how you're going to monetize the game, what to sell, how to sell it, how to run events. I think users are continue to get much more intelligent, and there's a lot more ways to monetize. So being able to do all that well is important. And I think there's a lot of studios that spend a year or 6 months or whatever time it is making a great game, and then they kind of come in later to kind of add in the monetization, add in the retention hooks. But that really just doesn't work, right? You really want to know that up front. Ideally, these are skill sets you have in-house, and if not, you want to find a way to do it. As far as data tracking, I've worked with studios that they understand how important it is to track data and do analytics. I think it's hard not to realize how important that is these days in free-to-play. But I've seen teams that they don't really quite know what they should be tracking or how to track, and they end up tracking everything, and in ways that are so complex they can't do anything about it. I saw a game that basically did these really complex matrices to see every item in the game that every character had and every single stat, and basically it would have taken that lead engineer's time who implemented it to try to parse this data in some way. So the data was never used, and it was wasting engineering time. So really kind of knowing what to track and how to track, and then ultimately how to analyze it is certainly a critical part of doing this. Test market, obviously you want to have the expertise to run it, to do a soft launch, and really to take the time to do it. I think any time that you're kind of rushing through a test market and not taking the time to learn that data, you're doing a disservice, right? Regardless of whether you're publishing it yourself or doing outside, right? There's certainly companies that can help with a variety of these things if you do want to go the self-publishing route, but it's a critical part of it, as is genre expertise. So mobile expertise is something else that I think is important, and that's not the same as free-to-play expertise. I think over the years, as more and more companies move into mobile, there's just so many aspects of it that can differ a bit, whether that's specific parts of game design, UI, UX, understanding your target audience. I've definitely seen teams that have built up kind of a skill set in a specific genre, whether it's a certain type of tactical RPG, strategy game, whatnot, and they've done that game well in other platforms, be it web or handheld, and then they come to mobile, and they're building these great-looking, gorgeous, fun games, but they don't quite do enough to really reach that mobile audience and tweak that user base, because your target audience will differ. And so maybe it's a great game, but it ends up being much more niche than intended. So really kind of making sure that you have that mobile expertise either in-house or that you find a way to get it somewhere else, because I do think that continues to be important. Obviously, there's things like device capabilities, coverage. You want to hit a wide range of devices, localization, internationalization. I think regardless of whether you're initially self-publishing or using a publisher, certainly there's lots of people that are going to talk about all the ways you can publish in other regions with other sub-publishers. That continues to be a good way to hit lots of other markets. Server security, basically there's lots that goes into doing this, and ideally you want this either skill set in-house or you go outside. Another area that I see a lot of developers kind of skip is project management and production, right? When you're kind of building up your studio, you're excited to hire in those engineers and those artists and maybe some designers, and you kind of figure, well, we'll just make the project, it'll all work out. We don't need a schedule, we're just going to build it and it's going to be great. That can be really problematic for a lot of reasons, right? One is, as we talk about your financial runway, if you're not really able to be predictable, are you really going to be able to afford to take the time you want to make this game? If you are working with a publisher, and even more importantly, if you're working with a licensor or an IP holder, it's really critical that you're able to actually hit some dates and deadlines, right? If you're trying to launch to some kind of real-world IP tie-in, you obviously want to hit that date. And also when it comes to if you're able to completely self-fund yourself and you want to take 2 years building the game you want to do it, that's great. Like, I applaud your ability to do that, but that's often not the case. And so it's really important, I think, to have kind of this skill set in-house to kind of make sure you're hitting it. And if you do work with a publisher, or if you're getting outside investment and your game keeps delaying and delaying because you're not really being predictable, obviously that can cause problems. And it can also be an issue for future projects, right? Even if you work with a publisher and you launch a successful game, but you were really bad at hitting your dates and deadlines, and you're kind of pushing out projects, they might not want to work with you again. So that's, I think it's easy to kind of skip past that, right? You're not probably going to have every skill set in-house, especially in the earlier days of the first couple years of a studio. But I do find this one getting overlooked, and it can be quite frustrating, especially if you're on the publishing side of it. So I think in general, I hope I'm kind of clear that I really don't think there's one clear question or answer whether you should be self-publishing or whether you should be finding a publisher. I think it's really important to kind of know who you are as a studio and what skills you don't have, and find a way to get those skills or get that knowledge base. And maybe that's working with the right kind of publisher. And certainly there's lots of publishers out there. A lot of them are going to give you a lot of expertise. They're going to dig into your data. Or there's some that are really just more installs based. And I think you want to make sure you're kind of growing your team. So if you are working with a publisher on say, a first game, really try to build up that in-house skill set. Not just so you can self-publish later, but the more you have that expertise in-house, the better you can work with whatever third party you may or may not be working with. Right? As involved as those guys are in your game, they're not your in-house team living and breathing it every day. So they're never going to be able to kind of know your game data as well as you would if you had that skill set, in-house, sitting next to the rest of your team. So that's kind of, I think, the gist, is there's really no one answer, but I really think it's important that you really holistically look at who your team is, what you do and don't know, and really fill those gaps, and make sure you're learning the right lessons. As I was saying before, it's really frustrating when, a team feels like the lesson they learned was they didn't get installs, and then they totally crash, like they totally, knocked it out of the park and they do great, but then they realize that, we didn't actually do monetization right, or they took some assumption they didn't do the data, or vice versa. So that's kind of the gist. So I don't know if we have time for questions, but if we do, I'll take them.
Absolutely, yeah. Has anyone got questions to that? I'll ask some if not. The key thing for me is, it's like you rightly say, the skill set of getting content to market is much wider than a lot of studios expect. It's not just a case of sticking onto the App Store and hoping, and it's not fire and forget. And I think also a key part of this is moving forward, that whole free-to-play model is so intrinsically bound into games as a service.
Exactly.
And that requires such a completely different way of looking at development, but post-development work. So if there was one key skill set that would really tip the balance, which one do you think would be the most important?
I think if you have an in-house skill set that really understands, I guess, general free-to-play metrics like core monetization and retention, and so that you're building that in from day one in game design. Because I think you can't build a really fun game and kind of add that in later and have it be a real part of the game from beginning to end. So I think really building up that skill set in-house and making sure that you're looking at it from day one of development, I think is really critical.
It is an area I can't quite decide on. I generally agree with you, but I think the only caveat is I think you can add monetization after the event, but only if you basically rewrite the game.
Exactly. Exactly.
I know that's a kind of stupid thing to say.
That's fair.
But there's a kind of reason for doing that, because I think a lot of indies have a particular mind, or particularly indies, not just indies, but particularly indies, have a mindset that this is the game I want to make. I want to make this game. It's Monkey Island meets, Clash of Clans. Crazy idea. Nobody make that. Seriously, nobody make that. Monkey Island meets Clash of Clans. That's the game I want to make. Oh, I made it. And by the way, you can't make money out of it. Okay. Right. Well, we'll make that free to play then. Well, that's a whole exercise in game design.
Exactly.
Right there. And that might be worthwhile doing.
Sure. And I've certainly seen success with that, right? A team spends a year and a half making this great game, thinking now we're going to find a publisher, launch in 3 months, but really you have another year and a half to actually make it be a viable business.
Exactly. Yeah. Mike, you had your hand up. Should we get you a mic? Hit Mike and Mike. Just because it's being recorded.
Thank you. Well, that kind of talks to my question. It's really hard for me to find a publisher early enough in my product cycle where I can actually adopt some of those early design phase elements. Most of the time, publishers are only willing to talk to me when I've got something that's 90% done, and then they want me to rip it apart and start putting in stuff their way. That seems awkward at best.
Yeah, you know, I've seen different sides of it. I think depending on, I mean, as a publisher, the earlier you sign a game, you're taking on more risk because you don't know the final project, right? So if it looks like the upside reward's high enough, you can get involved earlier. Or often what you'll see is if it is very early in development, it's not quite at the point where it can be signed, you might get a lot of feedback where, you know, we don't want to sign you now, we like what you're doing, come back in, you know, 3 months, 5 months, X number of months with these things, here's some input, and, you know, let's see what it can become. And so you can kind of get some of that input early on, hoping there's a later business. But it can vary a bit.
And it is difficult because how do you tell the difference between feedback from that publisher which is actually useful versus feedback which is based on something that worked in some other game 3 years ago that they happen to like?
Sure, and that goes back to what's your internal skill set as a dev to even be able to vet and use that feedback. Which
exactly.
Some of it's probably great and some of it's probably outdated crap.
Yeah, well, exactly. And this is a kind of interesting thing I think about the stage we're at the moment. This early kind of indies who are coming in fresh don't have the history and legacy which can work in their favor to be disruptive. So yeah, anyway, on that note, I'm going to thank you very much. That was fantastic.